Okay. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. We continue our study of the commandments, and so we ask Almighty God to inspire us to not only how to live, to give us instruction as to how to live our lives, but also the courage to embrace the commandments and to model our lives after His sacred teaching. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay. So we continue on. We finish off prayer, and we just got through a little bit more of the commandments, and I think we got to the third commandment last time, which I think is where we left off. And that was maybe a nice way to break that up, because the first three commandments are oriented toward God, and then after that, the 4th through 10th commandments are oriented toward our neighbor. So sometimes you'll see the 2 tablets. You remember what Moses said coming down from Mount Sinai? He says, "Here are 2 tablets. Take 2 tablets and call me in the morning." That's an old doctor joke there. So the doctor laughed there. So, and sometimes you think, okay, there's 1 tablet and 2 tablets, so they probably put 5 commandments on each tablet. Okay, well, more traditionally, whenever you see it laid out, you probably will see 1, 2, and 3, and then 4 through 10, because it's been kind of a common way of depicting the 10 commandments to make the distinction of those focused on God and those focused on our neighbor. So we'll continue on now with the 4th commandment, which is getting us now more into the idea of the neighbor, the love of neighbor. So the 4th commandment itself, to honor your father and mother. I suppose I could have made that a question. I could have quizzed you to see if you knew what that was. But honor your father and mother, this is one of the commandments that is phrased entirely positively. So I say positive in the sense of it tells you what to do. A negative commandment tells you what not to do, and most of them say "thou shalt not" is the way they begin. But in this case, we have something that thou shalt do, to honor your father and mother. The other thing that's really interesting about the 4th commandment is it's one of the few commandments that comes with an expressed promise right in the commandment. It says, "Honor your father honor your father and mother, that it may go well for you in the land." It says so the prosperity of long life or blessings in life to those who honor their parents. That's something that's mentioned in the context of the commandment. So I think that's actually a nice thing here. What does it tell us that is important? It teaches us then to value life and marriage and family. And so we see that how fundamental this is, and that family is an important part of how we were made. So we're not made totally in isolation. We are made in communion, born into communion with other people, so that each of us has a father and our mother. And even if sometimes everyone's family circumstances may be different, and I know not every family is the perfect family that we might have seen on television in the 1960s or something like that, but nonetheless, there still is a family, and it reminds us that we are connected to other people, so we are bound together with them. Beyond just the notion that we need to look after parents, connected to the 4th commandment would be other people who also should be honored or respected. So the Catechism highlights several. It says that beyond our parents or those who are our elders, you might kind of consider that in terms of the respect that we would show to our elders, but also other things like teachers or leaders or magistrates, also those who govern us. And so that means that when a law is passed, it means that we honor those in positions of authority by respecting and obeying laws, especially those laws that are conform to the common good. So to respect, for example, those in law enforcement or things like that. So for young children, then them listening to their teacher, that's an important thing, that they might also be encouraged to confess if they are thinking about the 4th commandment. It would also connect with a superior and a subordinate, and so a lot of times in the work that we do, we may have a boss to whom we would answer, and that also should be someone who should be honored. He says, "Well, my boss isn't very honorable," but I'll try to honor your boss or your employer as best you can. And so that's an important thing to do. St. Paul even mentions that when he talks about masters and slaves, and they're to behave toward one another with a Christian attitude. So and so that's even mentioned beyond parents and children, but also masters and slaves and so forth, just where St. Paul goes into those kinds of things. So one of the things that we have is, and we'll get to this in the sixth commandment as well, as we talk about God having created men and women so that they are meant, in fact, to be in relationship or partnership with one another. And so here you have the notion of a kind of a covenant. And so for children and with their parents, there's a kind of covenantal relationship in which we are bound to one another. Just as God's covenant, his promises are irrevocable, so also this is how it is to be. The bonds of charity that draw a family together should be irrevocable. We know sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. But that's the pattern that we're given, or that's the image that is presented to us. So that covenantal relationship within a family marked by permanence and faithfulness, it's an important image and something for us to strive for. It's also, when we look to the family, the Catechism, and John Paul II brought this out in particular. I know he was very passionate about this. He calls the family the domestic church. So the church in its smallest element comes down to the family. So the family is a place where God should be honored, and in which that should be a place of prayer, and that is something that is taught to children by parents, and so that's an important thing for children to respect, for parents to take on that responsibility, and for children to respect. In addition to honoring, sometimes we make a distinction between a young child for whom honoring one's father and mother means to obey them, so they give legitimate commands. Okay, you're grounded. Okay, there you are. Okay, now try that when you're 25. Okay, it doesn't work so well. So you're grounded. Oh yeah. Oh really? Okay. So there's something that I think changes for adults. And so when you have an adult, that's why I think the word honor your father and mother, honor is actually a very nicely chosen word, because you don't say obey all the time, because that at a certain point we talk about a person's vocation, and children, as they grow up and become adults, they have to choose their path in life, and so they have to seek out their own vocation. And it's not for a parent to choose for a child. So when the children grow up, so they have to choose their own vocation, to discern that under God's direction. And so sometimes there's a point when parents have to let go there, and so that actually makes a big distinction. So then what happens to the relationship of honoring? Well, one can still honor and respect, and show proper reverence for one's parents, even if you're an adult. And in that sense, then the commandment is universal. What happens when you really get older and your parents are super old at that point? Okay. If I was to ask one of the children, what do you consider really old? I've done that before, so that's a dangerous question, isn't it? I ask it, how old do you have to be really old? And then they say 40, and then that's okay, no. But when you do get older, and then your parents are advanced in years, honoring one's father and mother also means caring for the elderly and the sick. So to look after, there's a heroic love that is there. That should be practiced, and so that's an important thing as well. So to look after and care for one's parents, especially in their old age. For people who are not Catholic, if you were raised outside the Catholic Church, then you did not have in your Bible the book of Sirach. But Sirach is one of these really great books. It was one of those Old Testament books written in Greek, so it wasn't accepted by the Jews, it wasn't accepted by Martin Luther. But it has been part of the Catholic canon. So it's an Old Testament book, it's part of the wisdom literature, and it is filled with references addressing fathers and sons and speaking very passionately about the way in which the way parents should look after their children, the way children should look after parents, in particular looking after them when they are in old age. And Sirach says that many sins are covered by charity towards one's parents when they are old. So that's actually, so Sirach is just such a beautiful book on that. It is something that when we look at the way in which we show respect for the family, it is something that should be defended in our society. It's something that is part of the strength of our social fabric. If we lack respect for the family and we don't really respect one another, then really the whole society can be shown to be sick in some sense. So it's actually a sign of a healthy society when there is profound respect and care for children when they're young, for the elderly when they are old. This is a cohesive element that is that we're constantly called for. What is it that the classic prophetic call would be? Is to make sure to protect and defend the rights of widows and orphans, right? It's kind of the constant prophetic call. Widows, those who are older women whose husbands have passed, that they would be protected. Orphans, the children who have no parents. So that's a measure of the holiness of a society. So to make sure that people in their families are protected and that they have adequate access to to have their needs satisfied within society. So, for example, providing for the education of children, and to make sure that families have the opportunity to support themselves by work and adequate access to housing, healthcare, things like that. That society would promote the free practice of religion, that we're free to worship God according to our conscience. And that we'd be free also from things that could be harmful in society. So, for example, things that can do harm to society, the proliferation of drugs, proliferation of pornography, or if there was crime or a lack of security. Society should help the family be safe from these things. And that's an important thing for a society to do. So when we talk about honoring the elected representatives or the people in positions of authority, they have a responsibility to also care properly for their citizens, as citizens show honor and respect to those in persons in authority. So the Catechism spends a little time playing up that relationship as well. So that's an important thing. So for children, when we're talking about little children, one of the things the Catechism brings out is the idea that they would show piety toward their parents. It's really filial piety is how it's said. So not just obedience, but a real kind of a respect for their parents, which, as I said, also continues into older age. Parents, their responsibility toward their children, to raise the children, to educate them, to teach them virtue. So parents have a responsibility of teaching children, teaching them virtue, teaching them to be holy, evangelizing them, so teaching them about God. Also, parents have, this is in terms of like what parents have the right to, or should have the right to do, freedom in even selecting the schooling for their children. So that's also mentioned in the Catechism. Then with respect to citizens and those who are in authority must exercise their role in service. So the idea of being elected to public office is to serve, and I think we kind of hope for that. We hope for the best when we elect someone, right? Feels like rolling the dice sometimes, doesn't it? So you hope, but that's what it should be. So the idea that those in public office are not meant to serve themselves, but they're meant to serve society, and so it should also be with a view toward respecting the rights of citizens. But citizens also have a responsibility to contribute to society. There are local elections coming up. No one ever seems to pay so much attention to local elections, right? But one of the ways that citizens exercise their respect and for those in authority, by exercising the right to vote. So you're encouraged actually to vote, not just on the first Tuesday in November, but also on April 1st, which happens to be the day of the local elections here today. So anyway, so oddly enough, we're encouraged to vote, and that's one of the things mentioned in the Catechism. Paying your taxes, okay, obeying the law. So it's not April 15th yet, but I can still tell you that paying your taxes is one of the things that is mentioned in the Catechism. Also, the idea that we would care for the foreigner in our midst, that is mentioned, but also that we would practice obedience to the laws of a society, unless those laws themselves would be contrary to Christian morality. And then the idea of a conscious objector is mentioned, and that sometimes is an important thing for us to stand up for things, even if society says no, but if we know that there are things that are right. So there's kind of an interesting interplay there between obeying the law most of the time, but when it comes to something for which there might be a conflict of conscience, then we have to act and follow our conscience. The church is also held up as a kind of a society, the one that stands out with very different characteristics. It's unique because its authority derives from God. So unlike, say, for example, a city or a township or a state or a country, so the church also has some of those same elements. And we still talk about those in authority or serving, and those who are governed by the church then also owe that same kind of respect and obedience, but it's one that's really rooted on the plan of God. So there's sort of a brief discussion about that. And that really, those are the main points that are brought up in the fourth commandment. Before I go into the fifth commandment, let me just pause there to say, is there anything there any questions that you might have? Or even anything that just stood out there as like I never thought about it that way? Or an observation like that? You don't look like you're in a talkative mood tonight, so I'll just keep talking if you don't. But anything that jumped out to you. And going once and going twice. Okay, and now the fifth commandment. Okay, so let's go on to the fifth commandment. So the fifth commandment is, here's my quiz. I'll get you to talk now. So it is, thou shalt not. Number 5. Thou shalt not kill. Okay, so the it is. I've read some things that the word that's being used has more to do with thou shalt not murder or commit murder. The notion that killing, is there a distinction between the two? There's a lot of killing in the Old Testament, it seems, but the idea of planning to, like for example, there can be conflicts, warfare between nations or circumstances in which one is defending. We'll get a little bit into some of that at the end of this section. When maybe in defending someone or defending a country, you might have to take life. You may not be able to avoid it. And the sense is that that's not what the fifth commandment is after. That has more to do with self-defense. And I will come back around to that. But maybe one of the ways to look at the actual translation from the Hebrew is to say that to commit murder, in the sense like a person is slaying or murdering another person. That's what we have here. What does that tell us? It tells us that life is sacred. And so the sacredness of life is really upheld in the fifth commandment. One of the things that we get from Jesus, though, is he's not satisfied with just a simplistic surface level reading of the commandments, because the Sermon on the Mount, he says, you have heard that it was said, you might remember this passage, thou shalt not kill. But what I tell you is, what did Jesus tell you? Where he was going to elevate that up to the next thing. What was the thing that Jesus told you not to do? Thou shalt not. You've heard it said, you shalt not kill, but what I say to you is, thou shalt not be angry, harbor anger toward your neighbor. So even the idea of anger. So the person who says raka to their, okay, that's in the text there, and the person who says you fool is liable to Gehenna. So he talks about the idea of extending the commandment, so it's not just simply killing, but even anger can be a violation of the fifth commandment. This goes back to different passages, even from the very beginning. What was the first murder committed in the Bible? Cain and Abel. Okay, so Abel was killed, and we're told that the lifeblood of Abel is crying out from the earth for vengeance. And so even there, we already have a sense of the sacredness of life, the sacredness of lifeblood. It also was mentioned in after the Noah and the flood. See, everyone knows the story about Noah and the flood, about like getting the animals and putting them in the ark. But a lot of times, people don't necessarily read Genesis 9 when the flood is over, and then you hear the pronouncements that God makes at the end, and he talks about the lifeblood of any living creature is sacred. And so you shall not eat blood, is mentioned in Genesis chapter 9. But in there is also a reminder that God says that if anyone sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. So it's a little kind of a palindrome or chiasm there, kind of a poetic way of saying that. But so this isn't just Jesus and not just Moses, but even from very early on in Genesis, we have the idea of protecting and defending lifeblood, not taking a person's life, that their life itself is sacred. Now, what to say about self-defense? So let's just stay in the personal circumstance. So you hear people say self-defense. So that's a defense you can advance. Person's charged with murder, and they say, it was self-defense. Okay, that notion is also very much expressed in the Catechism, because the idea of defending oneself, meaning protecting one's own life, is very consistent with the commandments, but also the notion that we may have to defend others. So the idea of defending another person or protecting someone else's life is also very important. There's a doctrine of what you might call a proportional response. So someone is coming to beat up another person. Okay, well, I'm going to bring a gun and shoot him. No, that's disproportionate. Okay, that does not fit, because that's too much of a response. So what's the least action one could take and still defend the other person? That in fact would be a moral thing. So to defend oneself and defend others is actually even here a duty. When it comes to defending society, so how do we defend the society? So people do horrible things. People may try to take another person's life. Well, that's immoral. So society has to deal with that. So how does society deal with people who may try to take another person's life. The death penalty, but I was just going to say through a means of incarceration or through punishment. By the notion that a person can be convicted of a crime, or that that is actually an important thing. So to administer justice in a society is an important factor of defending the society itself. So as to punish lawbreakers, so as to deter other lawbreaking. So that is also a part of the self-defense even of a society. Now in here, the Catechism also gets into that touchy subject of the death penalty. And this is an area where Pope Francis has modified the Catechism a little bit. And the notion that now the death penalty itself is not considered an immoral act absolutely. Historically, there have been times in which you have very serious wrongdoing, and perhaps you have some people in society who are just so dangerous, and at times when there may not have been effective means of adequately protecting society because we just couldn't guarantee that a person in fact could be restrained or rehabilitated, and so society may continue to be at risk. Think of very just grotesque stories of serial killers or things like that. Perhaps for the sake of defending the society, it's necessary to take another person's life because they're just too much of a risk or a danger. That's been part of the classic understanding of the death penalty, and that is legitimate, or at least it was. What Pope Francis has said now, what the Catechism has expressed, is that in our society today, it is likely that we do have effective means of isolating those with such criminal intent and finding ways to adequately punish them or to protect society without taking a person's life. And if society can be adequately defended without the need to take a life, then as the Catechism has said and Pope Francis has emphasized, is that then the death penalty need not be applied, and as he would say, actually, he would say that would be immoral. It's not immoral in each and every case, but in our present circumstances, it does not appear that it would be necessary, and so therefore, in our world today, it would be considered not acceptable. So, does that make sense? This was a little bit of a change, but I think it comes from the fact that we do live in a different world today, and so we do have means of protecting society, perhaps a little bit, that are more effective than the wild, wild west, where the Black Bart would come and stage a breakout from the county jail, and then Wild Bill Hickok is loose again, or something like that. So it's not. So this is a little bit different from days in past centuries like that. So do I want to say anything more about that? Anyway, so I know it's an interesting debate, and that's and I have heard people say, in particular, if we talk about protecting human life and we say that we want to protect the innocent children, then should we not also, if we say it's wrong to take life, the life of children, should we also refrain from taking the lives of the guilty? That's too extreme. Can we be pro-life and still pro-death penalty? I know for some that's a controversial topic, and I know there are different opinions, but some I think are very moved by that kind of an argument. The other thing too, and this is beyond the scope of the Fifth Commandment, but the idea that we would have means of rehabilitation. So what is it that a jail or a penitentiary, as we say, is supposed to do? It's supposed to bring about conversion. Can we rehabilitate? That's another debate as to whether or not prisons as they exist today, how effective are they at really rehabilitating? And I don't really have an answer for that. That's a much broader question, but it should be something, in an ideal sense, there should be a medicinal sense that you're actually somehow helping someone to improve, and that, I think that would be important. So what are other things that would be excluded under the Fifth Commandment? Obviously homicide, infanticide, which is the taking of an infant's life. There are actually a whole series of different words do you know what matricide is? It's not when you destroy your mattress. That's not what they. Okay. Matricide is to kill one's mother. Patricide, to kill one's father. Conjugicide. Conjugicide is to kill one's spouse. Okay, see, you didn't know that word. That's right. That's it. Suicide, to kill oneself. Suicide would also be contrary to the fifth commandment, because even one's own life. So it's not like we're the masters of our own life and we get to decide. So our lives are sacred too, and our lives are not our own. They belong to the Lord. We've come from the Lord and we belong to Him. So taking one's own life is also immoral. So that would be gravely immoral. The thing is, when we have people who may commit suicide, a lot of times what we would say today, though, is I think we would speak about this is someone who's not in their right mind, or someone who is perhaps affected psychologically by depression or other things, such that that they're in this desperate situation. So I think we tend to have more sympathy in those circumstances, and I think we would also commend them to the mercy of God, that God's not going to punish them eternally necessarily for that, especially if it was something that was committed under grave anxiety or depression. So we still, at funerals where a person has committed suicide, we still hold out hope. And that's always the message that's offered, is one of God's mercy in very difficult situations like that. That would exclude euthanasia. So euthanasia is another popular topic in the new state. In fact, even coming before the Illinois legislature, a bill on assisted suicide, or the idea of euthanasia. So the idea that what euthanasia is the choice to prematurely end a person's life in a time of pain and suffering. Is there anything wrong with giving pain medication and palliative care and helping a person who is dying? No. That's one of the things that we do. You'll hear in hospice, for example. But where we cross the line is where a person says, I'm going to decide on my own terms that I'm going to hasten my death unnaturally. So we accept natural death. Natural death is a part of life. So all of us will face a moment of death, and so and whatever we can do to mitigate pain is perfectly acceptable. But if it crosses over into taking life prematurely, then we would call that euthanasia. We would say then this also, on the other end of the scale, this would also include abortion. So abortion, the taking of life in the womb, to euthanasia, the taking of life prematurely at the end of life. For abortion, we would say that life begins at conception, or at least we would say that life should be respected from the moment of conception until the moment of natural death. When talking about abortion, and this also gets to be a very charged subject, there's a difference between what's called formal cooperation and material cooperation. I'll explain both of those. So formal cooperation is when we take direct part in an action. Okay, so I'm going to rob a bank. So I hold the gun, I hand the note to the teller, I take the bag of money. So that's all that stuff. That's all. I'm formally cooperating. I have taken part. I've taken part personally. Material cooperation is when you provide assistance to them. So I didn't actually do it, but I lent you the car so you could use it for the getaway. I bought the nylon, the pantyhose to put over your face. Okay. What else could I have bought? I bought you the gun. Okay, that's right. Then the ski mask. Okay, that's okay. That's okay. So you seem so non-responsive. I'm trying to get a reaction out of you here. So that's material cooperation. So material cooperation is also wrong. So that's also gravely wrong. But the problem is, material cooperation, I can be close to the circumstance, in which they call it proximate, or I can be quite distant from the circumstance, which means it's remote. So the grandmother who lent the teenage grandson the car to use for the summer, and that teenage grandson decided to use that car to commit a bank robbery. No, the grandmother didn't know that was what was going to happen. She lent the car because she wasn't using it and thought, oh, well, this will help my grandson. Technically, she has materially cooperated in robbing the bank. But that was a very remote level of cooperation, for which actually she would not have any culpability. So the idea of remote material cooperation, actually need not be sinful, or is certainly less sinful than proximate. So when talking about abortion, I chose the bank robber because it's a little easier to give some examples. But so the person who directly takes part in the procured abortion, formal cooperation. The person who, for example, drives the person to the clinic, pays for the abortion, that's material cooperation. But a person who, for example, participates in the Susan G. Komen run or something, or contributes to United Way, and some portion of those monies get passed to other, to Planned Parenthood or something like that. Technically, it's material cooperation, but it's so remote that that would not be considered to be immoral. But I know sometimes people kind of get into these things like, I can't do that because that group supports this group and this group supports abortion. So I know that sometimes comes up, and for some that's a very passionate subject. So any questions on that? I may have raised more questions by some of what I was just explaining. So good. The idea of causing death, what about indirectly causing death? What about unintentionally causing death? What about someone who's a drunk driver, for example, and someone dies? Is there moral culpability there? The courts would say yes. The church would say yes. So even if the act itself, I didn't intend that to happen. Okay, well, yeah, okay. And sometimes there could be things that would just be purely accidental. But if a person has failed through negligence, you might say that they still bear some responsibility. Maybe it's less responsibility than a person who was formally planning that. And this is where we get to distinctions in civil law. Is anyone a civil lawyer at all, or interested in law, or watches Law and Order? Okay. But that's where you have a difference between first-degree murder, second-degree murder, the negligent homicide, things like that. So our civil law actually makes some of those things as well. What else is also included under the fifth commandment as we get further out from here? The idea of scandal, to scandalize someone, is actually to do harm to their soul. Okay, you're not killing the body, but even here, so to lead others to do what is wrong, to lead them into sin, that actually can put their immortal soul in jeopardy. So that also falls under the category of the fifth commandment. Caring for one's health. Now, oftentimes we say that so to look after one's health is an important thing. A person who deliberately neglects their health, you might say you're now putting your own physical body at risk. So that actually could be something you could say would be maybe not the most serious sin. It's certainly not murder, but a person who neglects their own health is perhaps prematurely hastening their own demise, and that would be wrong. Also, and maybe this is around a lot more today, the idea of the cult of the body. People who on the opposite extreme spend so much time, this is where body dysmorphia comes in. So people who are too intent on that also can be on an opposite extreme, also not necessarily healthy, but so just to make that distinction. Respect for the body is an important thing, so bodily integrity. So to maim someone, to mutilate someone, so to harm them, even the idea of like sterilizing someone, that also can be a mutilation of the body. That would be lacking respect for the body. So just to kind of go in some other directions there, just to get outside the box. Kidnapping, taking hostages, that also violates bodily integrity. Terrorism, for example, very much contrary to the fifth commandment. That would all fall under this. Respect for the body. What about scientific research? I donate my body to science. Okay, is that okay? Yes, it is. Okay, I donate my organ transplants. Oh, well, that's violating my bodily integrity. Oh, no, but that's actually doing so in order to do good for others. So those would be acts of charity. And so there's nothing contrary to the moral law in people who choose to donate their body to science or who sign consent for organ donations. If a person was in such a serious state that they are not going to survive, but their organs can bring life to another person, that in fact is quite heroic. Also, the idea of respecting the dead. So showing respect for bodily integrity, even for the dead. We encourage people when we have funerals to show respect for the body, which we do by providing a burial for the body. But even when people choose cremation, which oftentimes is chosen more and more for financial reasons these days, the idea of the cremains or the ashes, as they would sometimes call them, they're not just something to be put on the mantle or something even to be put into lockets or something like that. So there are different things. Even there was something. The bishops have spoken about this. Human composting. Have you heard about that? Okay, I'm gonna scare you if I tell you what goes into that. Bad idea. Okay, the bishop says, well, this is not showing respect for the body. So even cremated remains, so it's legitimate to cremate, so it's not a problem to do that. We would encourage, if there are choices, first and foremost, we would suggest the burial of the body. But even if that's not to happen, the cremated remains, which is legitimate, still should have a final resting place. And so sometimes when this comes up, if it's cremation, I will always mention to the family and ask them, do you have a plan for their final disposition? So they should be interred or buried or reposed somewhere where they can say that they rest in peace, okay? If you're not in a permanent resting place, then you don't rest in peace, okay? Requiescat in pace, R.I.P., right? You've heard that. That's what that means, by the way. So rest in peace. Let them rest in peace. So give them a final place of repose. Also, part of the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill, is our responsibility to safeguard peace. So the idea of working for peace. This means that anger, which we've already said from the Sermon on the Mount, anger is contrary to the fifth commandment. Hatred of another person, hatred of a race of people would be contrary to the fifth commandment. Acts of violence, so I mentioned already things like terrorism, but acts of violence is contrary to the fifth commandment. We have a responsibility, and this is where I'll finish by getting into that last thing, the thing I said I was going to say before, which is the idea of war. We do have a responsibility to attempt to avoid war if at all possible. This gets into those bigger questions. And yet at the same time, the principle of self-defense still applies here. So the notion that it is legitimate to attempt to stop an unjust aggressor, that is a legitimate goal. And so the idea of defending those who are unjustly attacked is actually not contrary to the moral law. The problem is that a lot of times those situations get very complex. For example, today I could mention Ukraine and Russia, and that is a very complicated situation. If it was something that was just so much more clear-cut, then it's a lot easier to say, okay, we've got a really clear issue here. But then this gets into a thing called the just war theory that talks about what is it legitimate to do. The Catechism takes up that question, which I'm not going to delve into so much here, but if you're interested, it is under this section of the Fifth Commandment, if you'd like to read a little more on that. The Catechism also discourages the idea of building up arms, multiplying arms unnecessarily, so the idea of nuclear stockpiles, just simply fashioning more weapons, and what do we need? We need more weapons. Catechism discourages the logic behind that. So that's how the Catechism looks at that. It is good for us to try to overcome acts of injustice, to work to avoid inequalities in the world that may create conflict. These are all ways in which we can help live out the fifth commandment. Okay. Questions about that? Observations about that, or something that struck you, or it's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that, or I didn't know that, or anything.
You said about scandalizing.
Yeah.
It made me think of what Jesus said. We better have
a millstone
tied around your neck than to lead one of these little ones into sin. Is he like affirming that?
Yeah. So the idea. So the question is about scandal, and so which is mentioned by Jesus, who says that you should not scandalize one of these little ones by leading them into sin. The word is skandalizein in Greek. We get the word literally right out of the Greek. It's almost identically the same word, and it means to lead a person into sin or cause them to sin. And so anything that a person would do that would induce a person to turn away from a virtuous path, yes, that would be. And I think that it's a brief mention under the fifth commandment, but I think that it's probably put there in the Catechism because it's like it would be akin to killing the soul, meaning if you induce a person into sin or into patterns of sin or a life of sin, then you actually are potentially harming their immortal soul. And so their life is sacred, their soul is sacred, so we should not cause another person to sin. So yeah. Okay. Anything else? Okay, well then that just leaves the sixth commandment. So, okay, how much time do I have? Not enough, let me tell you. Okay, so we'll go into the sixth commandment. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay, so the sixth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. The Catechism opens up with laying the groundwork for this, reminding us that we have all been created in the image and likeness of God. male and female, we were created. And so there was a natural part of God's plan that created two different sexes. I know that's a controversial topic today, but a male and female, so men and women created by God and complementary with one another. And that complementarity is also willed by God. That's an important part of God's plan, is that, in fact, it's for this reason that a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two become one flesh. And so there is something in the difference between men and women that actually becomes life-giving when they join together. And that is all part of God's plan. So that's not dirty or, they're somehow necessarily corrupted. There's something that's part of a beautiful plan that was made by God, and that underscores the sixth commandment. Sixth commandment gets into lots of things that are not very pretty. Gets into a lot of ugliness in the way in which sex can be misused. But underlying that is a principle of something that is quite noble. And I think that's a good thing to say. Men and women are created different, but also of equal dignity. So the notion that there are differences between men and women that are not just merely external or physical, but it enters into every part of the body and also even into the soul. So sexuality is something that affects the whole person. I think geneticists today would say that you can actually see in every cell of the body that you have the XY or XX chromosome. So I think even geneticists would even say, even written into the fabric of the body is maleness or femaleness, but also in the soul. So even our souls. This might be a shocking news breaking. So breaking news: men and women are different. Okay, they think differently. They act differently. But both male and female, both men and women reflect also part of God. So in God, who is strong and tender and powerful and caring and sensitive, you can say that there are both masculine and feminine characteristics in God. God is without gender, but we have been created with gender. We are encouraged to accept our sexual identity that has been given to us by God. So that is not actually something of our choosing. It's something that we were created with when we were fashioned by God. And so one of the things also that Jesus does in the way he speaks about the sixth commandment, so you have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But what I say to you is, someone who looks lustfully after a woman has committed adultery with her in his heart. So he encourages chastity. So the idea of a chaste way of living, which is a way of underscoring purity. So the goal here actually is to Jesus calls us actually to purity. And this is something that God's grace can accomplish where maybe it might not be possible for fallen human nature. So because of original sin, so that's something that can cause immense struggles. It can be a very difficult challenge to embrace, but Jesus calls us to purity. And in this, this is to overcome the impurity of lust or lustful desires. It actually leads us to a greater respect for the human person. Because what is it that happens when lustful desires take hold? Then a person begins to look at another and to see an object of desire, rather than a subject. A subject is a person who is created by God, who is made and is valuable in God's eyes. So to see more into who the person is, and not just physical attributes, that is actually a much more beautiful way of behaving. So that would be more purity and the idea of integrity, as opposed to something that is to lessen or cheapen another person. So chastity. So we are all called to chastity. Chastity does not mean, so everyone's called to chastity. So the priests live chastity, married people live chastity. So chastity is, sometimes people confuse chastity and celibacy. Okay, so celibacy is to live without utilizing one's sexual powers. The chastity, however, is what we would call integrity. A person who has integrated their sexual identity into the whole person. So that way a person who doesn't have integrity lives kind of like two lives, or they sort of live in two halves. But an integrated person is whole and entire. So they can say that their entire life is unified. So that way bodily desires, but also the desires of the soul, don't run in two different directions, but they actually draw us together in one direction. That's chastity. And so chastity means that we avoid behaviors that would be contrary to that human dignity. So sexual activities that would be contrary to God's law, we avoid those behaviors because they take us away from God, or from duplicity, the idea of living in sort of two different ways. So kind of following God here, but not over here. It is necessary for us to really have a serious apprenticeship in self-mastery. That's actually the phrase in the Catechism, meaning this is something that takes effort. This is not something that is overcome or desires that are mastered in an instant, but is something that is kind of a lifelong effort which requires a certain amount of energy and commitment and dedication. It also means that we also grow in this over time. The Catechism brings out the notion that oftentimes the growth in the idea of sexual integrity or chastity is something that we appreciate more as time goes on. And so it's one of those things that we understand more deeply as time goes on. And so on one level you can explain, even to a child, or at least a child is old enough to have had health class. So don't do this. So you can explain it in a very simplistic way, but I think to really understand and recognize the beauty of sexuality and its right use is something we can appreciate more through life and through experience. And so it is something that we can grow in. The Catechism brings that out, which is actually very beautiful to say that. And so it's actually better for us. Another way of describing chastity is that we learn to govern our sexual desires rather than letting our sexual desires govern us. So what happens when a person's not living chastity? They themselves actually are more of a slave to the bodily desires than being the master. But we're much better off and actually much happier when we actually have mastered or disciplined ourselves. That's why this virtue of chastity is very closely related to temperance. So the idea of moderating desires, that's the cardinal virtue of temperance. And so we live a life that's well ordered. And even if it means a certain amount of self-denial, they say, well, that's the church just trying to kill all the fun. That's okay. No, it's actually the church trying to help you live a happier life, that you're actually it's more rewarding and more fulfilling when we live a life that's better ordered. So we have to learn to choose the good. We have to practice a certain amount of self-knowledge to know ourselves and to kind of know what weaknesses or strengths are and how best to live that out. To practice a certain amount of asceticism or self-denial. So a certain kind of penance, which is an important thing. To live a life of prayer, which we remain connected to God, who gives us the strength necessary to be true to His word. A kind of obedience to God's will. And it's long and exacting work. That's another direct quote from the Catechism. So something that requires continued effort. It takes personal effort, but it is also something that can be encouraged within the culture. And this is where I think the Catechism, when this was written, probably couldn't have anticipated the world that we live in today. And this is where, unfortunately, our culture is so sexualized, and elements within our culture, and there I could just imagine the availability of the internet, and then also what's on the internet is just so, who could have foreseen that something that the idea that impure materials have been available, well, yeah, that's always been true to some extent. But the fact that they're available in the way that they are now is something that is a serious problem in our society and in the world. It's something that can cause an immense amount of, it can be an immense challenge toward virtue, and there are many, many people I know who are affected by that and who struggle with that. And so this is one where, unfortunately, our culture is working against the individual virtue here. So a person uses their best efforts, that's what we hope for them, but we also, it's best if the culture encourages that as well. And right now, the culture is not encouraging that. It's really running very contrary. So that actually makes it even more challenging in our world. But we still hold up chastity as a moral virtue and as a grace, the fruit of our spiritual effort. Chastity orders us toward self-giving in each and every case. So whether for priests, for religious, for married people. So it's ordered toward the gift of oneself. And so when a person is misusing that gift, one way of summing up every misuse of that sexual power is to say that it's something that becomes selfish. I use it for myself, or I'm thinking only of myself. I'm focused on my own sexual gratification or my own personal satisfaction. But everything that becomes selfless leads us outside of ourselves, in which we begin to be more devoted toward another rather than to ourselves. And the fruit of chastity actually becomes friendship and true charity, that we actually learn what it really means to be charitable. What is charity? That's love for another. And so that kind of, so true charity is learned especially in chastity. So for those that are vowed to virginity or to celibacy, so for priests, for religious, so this means dedicating oneself entirely to the Lord. So that means living in celibacy. And that is to allow us, as St. Paul would say, to dedicate ourselves to the Lord with an undivided heart. And so so I have given up the opportunity for marriage and for family, but that's so that I may be able to dedicate myself entirely to the Lord and to the church. And so that's one of the purposes then of celibacy. But chastity for people in marriage means that they give themselves to their spouse. For them, what does chastity demand? What discipline is required there? The virtue of fidelity. So fidelity is required, meaning a person who is married is still also not allowed to have sex with everyone but their spouse. That's a check to see if I was going to shock you there a little bit. So there's still so everyone has some limitations put to them. And for them, it's fidelity, meaning it's that for everyone but their spouse, they are required to practice that chastity and practice self-denial. For those that are single, they're called to live in continence, to remain continent, or so to remain sexually pure. Though a single person may be discerning marriage, and so a single person is able to get married, whereas someone who's vowed to celibacy, like a priest or religious, does not have that option. Those who are engaged are still called to continence until they marry. Okay, and I know that's not a popular thing today, and a lot of times you see people that will then begin a sexual relationship and even move in together. The church discourages that, because until you're married, you're still not a husband and wife. Also, even sociologically, people who live together before they are married have a higher divorce rate. I know every time I'll tell couples that when preparing for marriage, and I know every time I bring that up that no one ever believes me, but that actually is the statistical fruit there. I'm not sure that I can entirely explain precisely why that happens, but that actually is borne out from sociological data. So we'd say that kind of proves what the church reminds us of. So some things that are then therefore not permitted when we talk about the sixth commandment. Let's see, can I continue to go through this? So lust we've talked about already. So that's the desire for another person. That's to treat them like an object rather than a subject. Masturbation would be excluded. Okay, that is also called as intrinsically and gravely disordered, because it has no self-giving. There's no self-giving to another person in that. So that is just simply a selfish act used just by oneself. Though one of the things, while it is actually a grave disorder, and so a serious sin, the Catechism also notes that this is something that may not be as grave a sin for each person, because they can be affected sometimes by their own affective immaturity. So an immature person may not really be as culpable or responsible because they don't see the harm in that. It can form a habit. There can be a habit that can affect or take away a person's freedom. Other psychological or social factors can also reduce a person's culpability. And so there's a certain sense of patience that the Catechism advises, and that this is an area that requires an immense amount of work and efforts to overcome. I think one of the greatest harms maybe in our society today is that oftentimes you'll hear people say that it's perfectly natural and healthy. Maybe you've even heard people say that with respect to masturbation. And there, I think really what the harm there is that not true. It may be something that affects a lot of people, especially going through adolescence, and that it can certainly happen, and they may not fully understand what's happening, but it's not as if it's something that is a healthy practice. It's not something that benefits the person, unlike sexual activity within marriage, in which their husbands and wives are actually drawn into a greater love for one another. So it leads a person outside of themselves to dedicate themselves more and more to another person, to physically unite themselves as one flesh. But there's no good that comes out of masturbation. So I think one of maybe the greatest harms, again, this is what I mean about cultural obstacles, is that the culture is telling you a message that actually is not true. And so that actually is harmful. And maybe many people are taken in by that, and it is something that becomes habitual, and that is actually really, really sad. So that's one of the dangers for us to be aware of. Just to briefly touch on some of these others. Fornication is sex with someone with whom you're not married, or sex with someone who, if you are not married, then sexual activity is called fornication. That, rather than being selfless, that is really more selfish pleasure. Pornography is really a scourge today, and hurts everybody involved. There are people who get taken into that industry, and their lives are oftentimes irrevocably harmed by that. It does no good to the people who then consume that, and it's also financially that it's a gargantuan industry. If you think that having like gambling in a society does a lot of harm, and gambling can be an affliction on society if there's tremendous gambling. It can corrupt a society, but so can pornography as well. Prostitution obviously defiles the body. That would be that's a lowering of oneself. Though that may be, a person may be in very difficult circumstances, and so there might be some sympathy for that, like Jesus and the woman caught in adultery, for example. But it does defile the temple of the body. We're meant to be a temple of the Holy Spirit. Rape is obviously a serious violation and does grave psychological harm. That would obviously be contrary to the Sixth Commandment. And then after this, I am going to pause there because there's actually more to say about marriage. And the next part I was going to get into here is homosexuality. And I am not going to start that when we're still basically an hour in. And so think of that as just a juicy way to start the next class. So, oh boy, strap yourselves in because it gets more serious from here. But so I'll pick up with that. But there is more that has not been covered here. So we'll resume with that the next time. So okay, glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.